Many thanks. My question is how to think about corporations in the framework of Kant's practical philosophy. And the first reaction might be that that's a non-topic. Kant talks about the state, federation of states, talks about individuals, friendships, marriages, the household. But corporations, a few passing references perhaps, or you might think, well, Kant never knew corporations as we tend to think of them as business organizations. My claim is that corporations take us to the heart of his practical philosophy. First, what do I mean by a corporation? The etymology is clear. To incorporate is to form several things into one body, or more specifically, several people into one organization. And let me note a parallel etymology applies to two other terms. Universitas turns several things into one. Collegium, a body of colleagues, a corpus, a body. Let me just leave that illustration hanging for a moment. Now, of course, college and university for us point to academic bodies, as they already did in Kant's day, but they're also types of corporation. The use of corporation specifically for business is a much more recent development. Here's some famous words from one of Kant's contemporaries, which apply to every sort of corporation. When people are consolidated and united into a corporation, they and their successors are then considered as one person in law. One person in law. In other words, to form several people into a corporation or a university or a college is first of all a legal matter. The people involved might already be cooperating in some way, but it's law that really consolidates and unites them, making them and their successors one person in law. And that's a first clue that Kant might have something to say, because of course law is so central to his practical philosophy. At the same time, it's clear that a large part of Kant's discussion of law, his discussion of private law, isn't going to do the job. Our rights as individuals, they enable us to associate and cooperate with others. We might even, in Paul Simon's joke, get together and call ourselves an institute. But our private rights also allow us to get up and leave if we want to. And then it's clear the institute was just a joke. One of the problems that motivates the book is then this doesn't help us understand the structure of our societies or of Kant's. For well over a millennium, in fact, with precursors going right back to ancient Rome, universitas, collegium, the Latin terms, our societies have relied on organizations that unite many people as one body or corpus. As corporations, the organizations persist and act independently of any specific person. To continue with Blackstone, all the individual members that have existed from the corporation's foundation to the present time, or that shall ever hereafter exist, are but one person in law, a person that never dies. Just like the River Thames is still the same river, though the parts which compose it are changing in every instant. Now, quoting Blackstone isn't going to convince you that Kant is a good place to turn. Let me say a little about Kant's own references to corporations and then offer some more philosophical considerations. To start with, Kant was a university professor one of his last works was exactly about universities. Here's some words from The Conflict of the Faculties. A university is like a factory with a division of labour between academic subjects, and we could add also a division of labour between professors and students who play their parts within a larger whole. And Kant also says, importantly, that a university should have its own autonomy because only the learned can judge the learned. Kant knew, of course, all about governments that want to meddle in scholarship and ideas. Another late work of Kant's concerns churches, one of the oldest corporate forms. So in Religion within the Limits of Reason Alone, he says that churches rest on public laws and have a constitution based on them. Priests and worshippers might think of themselves as a purely spiritual corpus mysticum, in the old term, but as a worldly organisation, they rely on laws to incorporate them. And Kant also makes the same point about autonomy. It's not for the state to dictate religious beliefs or practices. Like universities, churches rest on public laws, but shouldn't be controlled directly by the state. And then in the Doctrine of Right, Kant devotes quite a few pages actually to corporations. He mentions some that are now feudal relics, noble estates, knightly orders, clerical orders and estates. He plainly has no time for them. He says the state can cast off this burden when it wants to. He also talks about charitable foundations, where his attitude's more complex, but I'll leave that aside today. And then we have just one more passing reference to the trading companies of the civilized commercial states, as he ironically refers to the Dutch and the English. And he talks about the terrifyingly inhospitable behaviour of their trading companies. For example, the Dutch and English East India companies were both violent colonial projects that fundamentally betrayed cosmopolitan right. More generally, Kant says very little about business. He doesn't mention guilds, although his father belonged to one. He doesn't mention the direct descendant of the trading companies, that is, the business corporation. That's not because it hadn't been invented, hadn't quite reached its modern form, but states had started to charter them. So the Prussian state authorized its second ever business corporation in Königsberg in 1782 to refine sugar, and Kant himself had many shares in it. Where did that sugar come from? From the colonial trading companies. So, in the middle you have the main pillars of feudalism, all corporations, all gone. Then at the top left, the business organisations that accompanied the demise of feudalism, to which we can add that competitive business corporations supplanted the state-sponsored monopolies over the 19th century. And that leaves us with all the corporate forms that we rely on today, except the political variety. Political parties only emerged in the 19th century, and we could add around them various civil society pressure groups, also trade unions, as central to modern democracies. But then we have the institutional structure of our societies, really almost the entire structure, apart from states themselves. Before coming to Kant's philosophical importance, let me just note that it's hard to know where to turn for illumination here. Political philosophers have said strikingly little. Of course, some corporations come up in debates about civil society. Business corporations are a major topic in, say, political economy, but in corporation itself, ignored or taken for granted. Yet it's absolutely essential. It's not just that we rely on these organisations, they're also essential to a liberal separation of powers. To varying extents, they're separate from the state, thus Kant's reference to autonomy, no state control of scholarship, no state religion, no one-party state. Whatever concerns we have about business corporations, we don't want businesses to be mere subsidiaries of the state either. And there are many sorts of business corporations. Cooperatives are also corporations, for example. To underline that point about corporations and the liberal separation of powers, let me contrast Hobbes's attitude, which I'll use to circle back to Kant. So I already showed part of this iconic image. Arguably, the state itself is our overarching corporate form, bringing many people together in one body politic that outlasts every mortal individual. For Hobbes, a body that's constituted by an unlimited sovereign. And Hobbes, the non-liberal, insists that any separation of powers is incompatible with his sovereign corporation. So, no surprise that Hobbes was hostile to corporations in the ordinary non-state sense of the word. He likens them to parasites in the human gut, worms in the entrails. They undermine the larger body politic. Any organised power distinct from the state is a threat to the state. Quite rightly, Kant doesn't share that blanket hostility. He insists on the state's right to abolish feudal orders, but states must enable other corporate forms, churches or universities, for example. Like Hobbes, Kant recognises that even those bodies can pose dangers and need regulation. For instance, that religious sectarianism can endanger civil peace. But Kant's fundamental concern with individual rights also highlights a second threat. The point is simple and yet hardly noticed. To see it, we just need to appreciate the logical implication of creating these new bodies with their own legal powers. For example, a university has the legal power to employ lecturers. A charity, not the individuals involved in the charity, takes donations for beneficent purposes. A business trades and employs, earns profits or goes bankrupt. All those bodies are legal actors in their own right, or sometimes wrong. But it's not just for Kant that those bodies might infringe on people's rights, serious as that danger is. More than that, Kant's emphasis on legal form points to a more fundamental underlying problem. Just by existing, every corporation casts doubt on his basic principle, people's right to equal external freedom. Within the body politic, Kant frames that as civil equality. Everybody's right to recognise no superior among the people except one whom he has the moral capacity to bind juridically in the same way as the other can bind him. Or in other words, everybody's right to recognise no superior at all, since every individual enjoys the same legal rights, the same capacity to bind juridically. But then the formal threat on which so many material dangers supervene is this. A corporation is a person in law, but of course not a flesh and blood person, so it needs actual people to act for it. Just like the corporation of the state, a business or a university can do nothing unless natural persons act on its behalf. So some people, directors, employees, trustees, must have the legal authority to act for the corporation. They act in its name, not in their own names. They use corporate property and resources. They use people, other members or employees of the corporation. But the corporation itself is legally answerable for those activities as a distinct person in law. None of us is meant to have any superior among the people. Yet some of us here count as superiors, professors as against students, for example. All of us here count as inferiors, employees perhaps, or simply outsiders who are affected by the activities of these corporations and their agents. I've suggested that a fabric of autonomous corporations is essential to liberalism, and I could put the same point in Kant's Republican language too. But then, how can corporations be structured to undo or counteract that basic threat to equal freedom? I suggest it requires the same sort of measures that are needed to make the state into a public thing. So if you think of the head on Hobbes's image, for Kant, it shouldn't be an actual flesh and blood person with their own private purposes. That would be a superior among the people. It must be a public authority created by a republican constitution through democratic procedures. And my basic claim is that when people act for corporations, parallel conditions must apply. There must be a public purpose, there must be publicity concerning activities and the effects of those activities. If not elections, then at least clear accountability, especially for officers and directors. For some corporate forms, that's relatively easy to see, for universities and colleges, for example. For others, especially the business sort, it's been hidden because we don't appreciate that every artificial person in law invests some individuals with extra legal powers to bind juridically to exercise some portion of corporate power to benefit from that power. I want to say that formal point has huge material implications. In modern societies, the powers of major corporate directors, large shareholders, the darker pressure groups make a mockery of civil equality. For states, many corporations are too large, too secretive, too hyperactive to regulate. In Hobbes's grisly image, worms in the entrails of the body politic. If I were clever enough with AI, you might be grateful that I'm not, you could see some horrible corporate worms bursting out of the body politic here, destroying civil equality and destroying the state as a public thing that belongs to all of us equally. We thought the feudal corporations were history, but unless we appreciate the formal threat that every corporation poses and address it in terms of corporate purposes, structures, accountability, then we don't end up with a liberal cum republican separation of powers. Instead, we get the old feudal insults to equal freedom, to people's rights to govern themselves through liberal republican institutions. Thank you.